Okay, this next section we'll start talking about what is usually referred to as the Age of Jackson. Most of what we're going to talk about is stuff that's happening in the northern part of the country, not the southern part. As I've said before, the north and the south is going to develop at remarkably different rates. And so what we're going to look at are the sort of reform movements that are taking place in the north that aren't taking place in the south. And I'm going to say, for the end of this section, I'm going to go ahead and tell you what I believe is going on. What I believe is happening is this nascent industrialization, this mechanization that's taking place in the northern parts of the country, and the factory system and the wage labor system. All of these things have brought about its own set of problems. And what you're going to see, and it becomes very evident when you look at it on the map, what you're going to see, all of these reform movements are taking place in the northern part, where all of these reforms, where all of these this industrialization and stuff's happening, which is very important. Now, intellectually, these reforms are being led by a group of American philosophers and literary types called referred to as the Transcendentalists. If any of you have taken American literature, you've probably read Emerson, Thoreau, and Fuller. Fuller's poetries, Thoreau's sort of civil disobedience, On Walden Pond, and the numerous essays that Ralph Waldo Emerson has written. An example of what we mean by transcendentalists, what they believe is that the truth of a matter transcends the particular earthly expression, and the truth that's above, that transcends the actual event, is that which we need to focus upon. Okay, I'll give you one example from Thoreau's from his book On Walden Pond, which is usually referred to as Walden. He talks about the fact, most people when they read it, they think of it as it's just a nature story, that he's just telling stories about nature. But what they don't understand is that Thoreau is a transcendentalist. He believes nature teaches us. He believes nature teaches us these kinds of lessons. For example, he's got one of his stories in Walden is called The War of the Ants. The War of the Ants. What you have is little tiny red ants who are gathering food, and they're going from their nest to the food source, from their nest to the food source, back and forth, back and forth. And they've got big lines. They've got big lines, and they're all organized, and they're all working together, and they're all accomplishing this task. Enter 3 large black ants, really big black ants. Now, the black ants could destroy any of the small red ants because they're just so much bigger. They're just so much bigger. And so what happens, the black ants start attacking the teeny little red ants and killing the little red ants. Once this starts happening, all of the red ants stop from their activity of bringing food back to the nest, and the red ants converge onto the 3 black ants. Together, the 3 black ants are, the 3 black ants are working separately, whereas the little red ants are all working together. Working together, the little tiny red ants, any one of which is no match for a black ant, once you put them together, they defeat the black ants. They defeat the black ants. And as a matter of fact, they start breaking the black ants apart and carrying them back to the nest, basically as food. And that's how he ends the story. And so you look at it and you're like, oh, okay, good. A story about ants. But what's the story? What's the moral? What's the transcendent truth that you're supposed to take away from this work with the black ants? That even though individuals may be powerful, more powerful than everyone surrounding them, when the smaller red ants work collectively and they work together, they're able to defeat the large black ant. They're able to defeat the large black ant. Okay? This is kind of an indication about the criticisms of this nascent industrialization, this early mechanization, and the facts that of the factory system where workers are being pitted against management. The workers are actually being started to be treated like pieces of the machinery. Whenever you get into a factory, even to this day, a successful factory has a number of resources that they use to make a profit. They use up these resources in order to make their profit. They've got material resources, the raw materials. They've got capital resources, the money needed, right? They've got facilities resources. They've got equipment resources. They've even got their product resources that they sell to make their money. And then they have one final resource that they use up to make a profit, and that's called the human resource. When you go to work at a big company, you go to the human resources office. And so the idea for these transcendentalists is that the people are being used as if they were cogs in a machine. But if only they would rise together, regardless of the strength of the single solitary individual, the group is always more powerful. Okay? That truth is supposed to transcend the story of the ants, to be a teaching moment. And that's the kind of the way these transcendentalists. Now these guys are the philosophers. They are laying out this kind of philosophical understanding of the need for reform that's taking place in the North. All right? There will be some individuals who are going to attempt to put these philosophies of these guys in practice. For example, get my clicker working. In West Roxbury, Massachusetts, in 1841, there's a place called the Brook Farm. The Brook Farm. It really is kind of a retreat center for literary types, artists and writers and things like this. Basically, what it's supposed to be is a communal farm where everybody comes and they live together and they work together. They run the farm together, and then everybody benefits from the proceeds of the farm. All right? The problem is, most of the artists, when they come there, they don't actually work the farm because, after all, they're artists. And artists have to seek inspiration. And you probably don't find too much inspiration slopping the hogs. And so this is a very short-lived experiment. But it's the first time we see these ideas being brought forth by these transcendentalists being attempted, these collectivist notions, these collectivist ideas being brought forward. Now, another guy, one of these utopian notions, is a guy named Charles Fourier. Okay, Fourier is a French critic of industrialization in Europe. European industrialization happens about a generation before American industrialization, basically because the English kept us agrarian as long as they could. But in the 1840s, more than 24 of these Fourierist communities are going to pop up all over the northeastern part of the United States. Fourier, a modern French critic of modern society, is going to establish these communities, these short communities. He's going to refer to these communities as phalanx, like the ancient Greek military organization. He's going to call them phalanx. He teaches that individualism and competition are the evils in the world. That if we didn't have individualism and we didn't have competition, that we would no longer have greed and avarice and things like that. Now, he advocates for the communal ownership of everything. There would no longer be private property. Okay, no longer be private property. Very few of these communities survive for more than a few years because of the way that they are laid out. They kind of resist the notion of mechanization and industrialization, which is starting to take place, and an attempt to return to a kind of agrarian society that has a few skilled artisans, like carpenters and blacksmiths and things like that. But what they find is they can't create in this new day and age a self-contained community that no longer is dependent on people from outside their community. It just can't happen. Now, another group, and I put these in. There are more, but this one is kind of weird, so I like to include the weird one in here too. It's a group of people called the Oneida community. Okay, John Humphrey Noyes is their leader. This is a utopian community that is based on religious ideologies. Okay, Noyes preaches that those who have achieved salvation by joining their community are therefore without sin. Whatever actions they do, there is no more sin in any of their actions, because they're part of the community, there is no more sin. He teaches that private property is that which makes people greedy and that which makes people sin. Okay? So if we eliminate private property, we can eliminate greed and we can eliminate sin. Now, these are a couple of his disciples, the Cragans. He says the clearest and plainest place to see the evil of private property is in the institution of marriage. In the institution of marriage. So, in 1848 in Oneida, New York, they established a community, the Oneida community, based on a principle of complex marriages. Complex marriages. That means every saved man was married to every saved woman. So every woman was married to every man in the community. And they were encouraged to consummate those marriages as much as possible. Most people think that the hippies invented the whole free love movement, but these guys, multiple occasions, they are arrested for public displays of this affection as they came to the larger cities in New York, and so it's pretty bad. However, and one of the most interesting things is, out of all of these communities, this is the one that survives beyond the Civil War. This is the one that is going to make it, because people are like that. When the number of men in their community would start to diminish, the number of communities start to diminish, they'll send 3 of the women, probably the youngest women. They'll send the women to these communities surrounding them, and they will encourage the young men, 18, 19, 20 years old, to come join the community, because after all, when you come, you'll be married to her, and you'll be married to her, and you'll be married to her. And so it increases the number of men who come to the communities on a regular basis. One of the big problems is from the photographs that we see of these Oneida communities, because it lasts for almost 20 years. One of the biggest problems is that we see all the adults, all the workers, and then out in front of them we see groups of children who most of them know who their mother is, but none of them are going to know who their father is, because complex marriage. So again, the primary reason for this community cropping up is this notion that greed and avarice has approached because of the ideas of competition and private property. Okay, now there's a picture of the Oneida community. Matter of fact, if you go to Oneida, New York, the house still stands. It serves as a museum for this community, and along the walls you'll see all the photographs of the different generations of individuals who are part of the Oneida community. Now, as I said, there are other groups. Another one that's probably closest to being successful is a group called the Owenites. Robert Owen was a factory owner. Robert Owen, out of all these communal groups, was the one who actually believed that industrialization was the answer to these kinds of problems that we're experiencing. And so there will be Owenite communities. Owen owns the factories, but what he did was he connected the prosperity of his workers to the prosperity of the factory. So if you work hard and the factory makes a lot of money, then you make more money. So it's almost like communal ownership of a business. It's almost like all of the workers are shareholders. In a certain sense, I guess that's the easiest way for us to recognize it. But the problem is, if you're a worker, if the company doesn't do really well this year, then your wages go down. So most workers refuse to accept the risk of their wages going down. So the only recourse was to put them back on a straight salary, straight wage, so that when the company does make enormous profits, they don't share in it, because they accepted none of the risk involved in making that profit. Okay? As I said, all of these reform movements, we've got the Foyerists and the Shakers and the Owenites, all of these things are happening right up through here. They're happening in the Northeast. They're not in the South, except for one Foyerist community down in Texas. One Foyerist community down in Texas, you will find an attempt, but it only lasts for a year. Okay? All of these issues have the problem of what do we do, how do we do about what we're doing to the workers. Most of this pre-industrialization, these kinds of things, they're recognizing problems, and these are the kinds of answers that they're coming up with to alleviate those problems. Now, women's rights, we'll talk about this in a second. There it is. This is something you guys are reading. This is a picture of Elizabeth Stanton and Lucretia Mott. Okay? In 1848, 100 women, being led by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Stanton, are going to meet in Seneca Falls, New York. Okay? And as you've read in the paper, because you're turning in that paper before Friday, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of men towards women. Okay? They have this meeting, and they issue this Declaration of Sentiments. This Declaration of Sentiments is modeled exactly upon the Declaration of Independence. It lists grievances that men have historically committed against women, and then it demands full rights and privileges now. As citizens, they demand their rights now, not some gradual in the future kind of right. They publish this document and send it out. Now, by 1860, more than 24 of these conventions are going to be held, all in the North. All in the North, because again, suffrage issues are again particular to the North rather than the southern regions. Okay? Through these things, we're going to have an enormous number of suffrage movements rise up. And the suffrage movement is going to do well until the beginning of the Civil War. Most of these reform movements we're looking at are going to start, they're going to get a head of steam, and they're going to start moving forward until the Civil War starts, at which point they all get put on hold because of the Civil War. Now, most of these reforms are religiously motivated. The temperance movement, the moral reform societies, women's rights, and even the abolition of slavery. Most of them begin as religious ideologies. However, because of some of the issues dealt with, they move out of the church. They move out of the religious environments into secular reform movements. Okay? Well, I don't want to talk too much about the Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is something referred to being led by Charles Finney. You've read about him in your text. Around Rochester, New York, Charles Finney will lead a series of camp meetings where these ministers are preaching the gospel and telling people they need to change and demanding an immediate repentance of their sin. This kind of preaching is new, okay, based on the old puritanical style of preaching that was contemporary for the northern parts, okay? However, church membership during this period is going to more than double. Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians. And even though the Congregationalists and the Episcopals and the Unitarians, Dutch Reformed, Lutherans, and Catholics aren't involved in these kind of camp meetings, they see increases in their congregations also, simply because these people are in contact with these other people who have discovered a new religious fervor. This religious fervor is believed by most historians to be in direct response to the kinds of problems that they're seeing in the world. The rise of sin. I don't want to compare these two guys at this point. That's Jonathan Edwards. And here's Charles Finney, though. Charles Finney had been a lawyer. He had no real theological training. He read the Bible like a law book, right? He looked for formulas. He looked for formulas and recipes. How do you have revival? You have revival by doing point 1, point 2, point 3, point 4. Bam, you got revival. He conducts a 6-month revival through the winter of 1830 in Rochester, New York, which means he set up a big old tent in the winter in Rochester. If you've ever... See, when we're watching the news in the wintertime, and they start showing how bad the winter is in other places, the one place they always show is Buffalo or Rochester, New York. They always show those two places because the winters are treacherous. Charles Finney kept crowds. This was supposed to be a 1-week campaign where he would come to Rochester, preach for a week, and then move on to the next place. He winds up staying there for 6 months because people keep packing his meeting hall. He said it was fertile ground. There were changes. In 1825, the completion of the Erie Canal creates prosperity for these little river towns that pop up all over the place. They pop up, they're prosperous in size because their populations start to increase, plus economically because everybody's working on the canal. So they're making lots and lots and lots of money. With this money and a very tightly packed population, you get things like what we refer to as vice rising up in the communities. Prostitution and drinking and gambling. These kind of things come with the close proximity and lots of discretionary spending. Okay? This is what Finney's preaching against. He's preaching against the sin of these things and for these people to repent and change their ways. It's in this fertile ground of upstate New York that you're going to start having the invigoration of the moral reform societies and the temperance movement to stop people from drinking. Okay? Christian benevolence societies will pop up all over. Sunday schools for children. Because most of these children in the North in these factory systems are working in factories. And so they go to Sunday school, and that's where they learn to read. Their textbook is the Bible, but that's where these kids are going to learn to read. They are also going to force these towns to honor the Sabbath, stop delivering mail, close down stores, no public transportation on Sundays, things like this. And then a number of missionary societies, sending missionaries all over the world, especially the African Inland Mission, the China Inland Mission, and even the South American Mission. All of these missionary societies are going to start popping up as a result of the Great Awakening. Okay? Quickly, we'll talk about the temperance movement. Evangelical fervor for self-discipline. The word temperance means self-control. Okay, 2 things are destroying the families. These preacher types are saying. The first is alcohol. The second is sexual sin, and we've got to put a stop to both. Okay, now drinking is on the rise. By 1830, the consumption of alcohol for the average person looks like this: 9.5 gallons of hard liquor every year per person. 30.3 gallons of hard cider, beer, and wine for every person over the age 13. For every person over the age 13. So that means some people drinking more than 9.5 gallons a year of whiskey. Yeah. Every class of people drink at this point, whether you're rich, at college, part of your tuition is your ale ration that you receive with your dinner. If you're in the Army and the Navy, you receive your rations in the Army and the Navy. Okay? This guy, all the way back in 1810, health reformers in New England. This is Lyman Beecher, Harriet Beecher Stowe's dad. Okay? 1826, he founds the American Temperance Society. He says drinking leads to these things, leads to poverty, leads to idleness, and leads to crime. That's what alcohol does. And it leads to family violence. They use the methods of the revivalist preachings to preach against drinking during this time period prior to the Civil War. And it does have an impact. It does cause drinking to decline. And the temperance unions will pop up everywhere. In 1836, it demanded total abstinence. It became a political issue. Towns start denying taverns liquor licenses. They're going to try to wipe out the dram shops, the little places on the road where you can just stop and get a drink. 1845, consumption is down to 1/4 of what it was in 1830. And these temperance folks believe that this is a good start. Okay? In Maine, 1851, they will pass the first prohibition law, which bans the production of sale of alcohol in the state of Maine. Later, when other states start following suit, doing the same thing, even the national prohibition will be referred to as the national Maine law. Okay, we'll stop right there with this video, and we'll start the second part of the Age of Jackson with moral reform societies and the Society to Abolish Slavery, and then we'll do 2 other sections, and then it'll be time for you guys to take your